time to finish off Season 1 of the Goblin Slayer Cut Content series, this time taking a closer look at the Goblin Lord Arc from episodes 10 to 12. However, not only will we be going through the changes from the manga, but thanks to the help of Salazar84, I can also comment on some of the major aspects skipped in the light novel. So let's see how this arc was portrayed across not one, not two, but 3 different mediums. But first, today's video is sponsored by Return of Warrior, a fantasy MMORPG based off the more popular Risk Your Life game from 2005. It's not a game focused around visual aesthetic, but rather on bringing a classic and refined take on the most fundamental mechanics of old-school MMORPGs. You've got your custom character and class creation spread across 14 different types, a fleshed-out skill and non-target combat system that allows for a versatile yet simple gameplay experience, then numerous quests, weapons, armor, and accessories spread across an exotic open world. Not to mention the action-packed faction combat PvP that you can engage in once you reach level 40, which really only takes 1 or 2 days to do. So if you're interested in a more traditional action MMORPG that literally just drops you right in, then use the link in the description and try out the open beta for free today. Now, let's begin. Starting with episode 10. If we use the manga as a timeline reference, we jump all the way back to chapter 10 from chapter 29. You see, we had a slight change in the chronology of events, most likely in order to end the anime with a high-impact arc, one that focused more on our protagonist rather than the Rivertown arc that focused on Sword Maiden. This episode in particular was more for the anime to try to fit together all the cut content from previous episodes, basically trying to make sense of all the scenes that should have happened after the Ogre arc, but instead was glossed over to get straight to the Rivertown arc. And given that it's a rather slow episode focused more on Goblin Slayer and the people around him, you'd expect there to be some sort of exposition or important dialogue that couldn't be fit in, though that really wasn't the case. It was quite consistent throughout both mediums, with very few minor differences. For example, one would be a moment of peace that both the anime and the manga skipped. It happens when Cowgirl and Goblin Slayer were walking to the city together. And remember, at this point in the manga, Goblin Slayer had only just fought the Ogre, so his character still hadn't quite warmed up to Priestess and the rest of the party yet. He exhibits behavior that I would consider to be pretty unusual for him. He takes a moment to enjoy the fresh air, close his eyes, and comment on how that moment that he was just in was nice. Much nicer than hunting goblins. It's something that you definitely wouldn't expect Goblin Slayer to say, especially so early on in the story since we're still perceiving him as this single-minded goblin-killing machine. They then get into the city, where Goblin Slayer talks to Budget Lancer, then proceeds to watch Discount Guts training a few younger adventurers. They actually all have names too. Well, as far as names go in this series, but this big guy is Heavy Warrior or Heavy Swordsman, and he's training 2 boys called Apprentice Warrior and Scout Boy. We see Goblin Slayer approach the woman called Female Knight, and all 4 of them are actually members of the same party, so that's pretty much how you'd identify them if you ever needed to. But rather than talking to Female Knight as we saw in the anime, in the manga, he instead watches from a balcony while conversing with the guild girl. They talk about the training that they're watching and how the guild has been trying to establish a building that's dedicated to having retired veterans train new adventurers, which is understandable considering that one of the most prevalent issues to the Adventurers Guild are that rookies don't really have much skill or any field experience. It's a similar conversation to the one with Female Knight, about educating newcomers on ways to survive. And it also shows that people are making an active effort to prevent the unnecessary loss of the rookies' lives. Now, everything else regarding this episode is more or less accurate to the other mediums. So let's jump straight into episode 11, covering chapters 11 to 13 of the manga and chapter 11 and 12 of the light novels volume 1. It's a heavy start to the episode as Goblin Slayer confronts Guild Girl about the impending threat. And as he describes the horrors that she'll encounter if she stays, Guild Girl is shown to understand a double meaning to his words. Yes, it was a tactic meant to frighten her, but she smiles, still knowing her fate because she was happy at the fact that Goblin Slayer was worried about her. Then, as Goblin Slayer leaves, we're given a glimpse into his head as we're shown his thoughts in the light novel. He thinks that her reasons for staying are absolutely foolish, and that she could have already escaped to the city no problem. He even thought about forcing her to leave by knocking her out and taking her somewhere safe, but he couldn't. He couldn't because that would make her cry again, something that he promised the uncle he wouldn't do, or at least try not to. which in itself was something that Goblin Slayer had trouble even saying. You see, Goblin Slayer wanted to say sure, yeah, I won't make her cry again, but he just couldn't lie about it. At that moment, he really believed that he wouldn't be able to keep the promise of not making Guild Girl cry again, but he says he'll try anyway, even though he knows how impossible it currently seems. Which now brings us to the guild hall. Goblin Slayer makes his request, but it's not until he mentions the number of goblins involved in the attack that everyone finally starts to pay attention. The reason for this is because most of these veteran adventurers had a goblin slaying quest as their first one. They're already well aware of how difficult goblins can be when they're in numbers, especially in an open field. Then when he describes the Goblin Lord as being the top rank in the goblin world, in the manga, he refers to them as being equivalent to a platinum rank, giving us a sort of gauge of what level they stand in comparison to our adventurers. The next notable scene is when Goblin Slayer offers his reward of everything. Everything meaning everything within his own discretion to give, he will, and not just physical possessions either. This spurs a joke from Spearman, where he asks, what if he wanted Goblin Slayer to back off of Guild Girl so that he could have her? Goblin Slayer, obviously not knowing it was a joke, responds simply by saying that she isn't his to give. We then see that Goblin Slayer's reward of everything does get Spearman and the witch to join in, but aside from them and his usual party, the rest of the adventurers were still very hesitant. It's not like they wanted the farm to be destroyed or anything, but the reward was still pretty measly, and this was a risky quest that certainly wasn't worth losing their life over for nothing. It's only after Guild Girl gives the proper reward that people start to join in. As we cycle through everybody who's all hyped to get in on the reward, we're shown the Heavy Warriors party again, and there's a bit of backstory that I haven't talked about yet regarding their younger members. Here we see Scout Boy and Druid Girl. They both lied about their age so that they could become adventurers, and at this point in time, they had been a part of Heavy Warriors party for at least 2 years. Then this random dude that pops up a few frames later is called Half-Elf Fighter. He's also a member of the same party, and has been so for at least 5 years, but he's pretty much a non-existent character. So everyone joins in on the quest, and Goblin Slayer more formally thanks Guild Girl with a bow. Now we get to the night of the attack, which is where the most significant cuts happen. First off, the little speech that the Goblin Lord gave here was more than just grunts and loud noises. In the light novel, the goblins never speak. It's more of an explanation of what the goblin is saying or what it's thinking. Whereas in the manga, it's translated speech bubbles over what I assume to be the made-up symbols of their language. But here's what the Goblin Lord says. He points out the light as a cursed one where the very adventurers who attacked their nest and killed their brethren are all living. He gets them ready for their supposed revenge and tries to get them all rattled up by saying things like skewer them alive and take their woman and force them to breed for us. The Lord goes on to outline the plan. Take the farm, eat the livestock, breed some more, then attack the main town with their sheer number, and after winning, build a goblin kingdom. It's all wishful thinking if I do say so myself, but who says the goblins can't dream? You wanna know what the funny thing is though? This isn't even what made the goblins motivated to fight. They couldn't even really understand the Goblin Lord's plans. They were, however, angry towards the adventurers, as well as excited to know that at the end, there would be some playthings waiting for them. Anyway, the Goblin Lord basically sees the adventurers the same way that the adventurers see goblins, referring to the word itself as a filthy one, best used to describe filthy creatures. He was so filled with hate towards the adventurers that it wanted to pound stakes into each of them until they died, or at least repented for all they did to goblin kind. You see, the Goblin Lord is actually quite similar to Goblin Slayer, in the way that they both had their homes destroyed and then used that experience to fuel their hate, get stronger, and strike back in revenge. Once again, highlighting the cyclic nature of the events that lead to the creation of people like Goblin Slayer and creatures like the Goblin Lord. As I've said before, it's two sides of the same coin. Now we get to the infamous meat shields. They're explained to be captured women and children who are tied to boards, which, according to the Goblin Lord, is a tactic that supposedly renders magic and arrows useless, out of fear that the humans might kill their own. It's presented in contrast to the goblins, who, if confronted by the same tactic, wouldn't think twice about shooting their own if it meant hitting the enemy as well. Regardless, before all the goblins are put to sleep, the shaman goblins notice that magic is being cast on them. So, in response, they quickly strike back with a lightning spell of their own that even manages to strike and kill one adventurer. It still doesn't stop the dwarf's stupor and witch's sleep magic from kicking in. Though in both the manga and the light novel, it's actually a faceless spellcaster who casts the sleep spell. So why the switch up? We assume that it's most likely to make sense of the witch's positioning. You know how she has to be close to Spearman to save him from arrows with her deflect missile spell. The Goblin Lord, who's spectating the battle from afar, sees his army getting destroyed, so he plans for a counterattack by getting his cavalry of wolf riders to scatter the adventurers by flanking from both sides. While the adventurers were prepped for this, though the anime made it seem like a pretty one-sided fight, there were still adventurers that were getting killed, even before the hobgoblins and champions showed up. So it's not like no losses were being taken, but it wasn't anything significant either, just a few unlucky souls with bad timing. The light novel even says that in a matchup between a human and a goblin, the human would always be the most likely to win, so long as no bad luck struck them during the fight. I guess those few adventurers were just unlucky. But when faced against the hobs and the champions, well, that's a different story. So we get to all the veterans taking on the bigger goblins, which was a pretty epic scene, not gonna lie. But Spearman actually wasn't part of the initial assault. He first stopped to get some water and clean his spear, as well as ask where Goblin Slayer was, since he wasn't part of the fight at all. Then we cut to the Goblin Lord running through the forest, while his thoughts are racing as he's trying to figure out why he failed. He had the troops, he had the wolves, but all of his plans were countered perfectly, and by way more adventurers than he had ever expected. He had no choice but to abandon that horde and come up with a revised plan of leading a new one, and adapting, just like he had always done. Which leads into a much more in-depth look into the Goblin Lord's backstory, and how he spent his entire life starting from nothing, learning, and eventually becoming the Goblin Lord. His first victim was the female adventurer we saw in the anime that let him live. This experience taught him that hitting adventurers hard enough in the head will take them down. So that's what he started doing, all while finding more easier and more efficient methods to do so, upgrading his weapon after every encounter with the humans. Then, by raiding towns and observing parties of adventurers, he learned how to use armor and lead a horde. He also trained his body to be on par with that of a human warrior. But it's not until he encounters an extremely physically superior opponent that he really starts to consider his battle tactics. You see, this jacked Conan-looking dude starts massacring all the goblins in the Goblin Lord's nest. The Goblin Lord sees this and immediately knows that he's unable to win that fight. So he thinks and adapts to this situation by taking advantage of the human soft spot for their own kind. He grabs one of the captive women and uses her as a hostage. While the adventurer has a moment of hesitation, he pushes that woman towards him and then uses his sword to stab through both of them and take down the intruder, claiming the warrior's massive battle axe as his own, which he now uses as his main weapon. Going back to the forest, we now see the Goblin Lord and Goblin Slayer encountering each other for the first time, which places ourselves right at the beginning of episode 12, covering the rest of chapters 12 and 13 in the light novel, as well as chapters 14 and 15 in the manga. As they fight each other, we're given Goblin Slayer's thought process throughout the whole thing. He points out the Goblin Lord's long reach, as well as the armor that he's wearing underneath the cape, identifying it as the reason for being unable to get close and strike a fatal hit. The axe was also something that Goblin Slayer was actively trying to avoid, so he uses the grass as a distraction to get up close, resulting in an exchange of blows, but Goblin Slayer uses that moment to figure out that the Lord's frontal attacks were pretty lackluster. That knowledge didn't really help much, because the fight continues and eventually Goblin Slayer loses both his shield and sword and can't get up. The Goblin Lord takes this opportunity to taunt Goblin Slayer, saying that minor wounds are nothing to him, and that he'll now avenge all his fallen goblins by torturing Goblin Slayer. Though something was different. Goblin Slayer didn't flinch, he didn't cower in fear, he didn't do anything, angering the Goblin Lord because it took the fun out of the death. As Goblin Lord is about to take the next self-proclaimed step in his legend, that's when Priestess shows up to cast protection. Goblin Lord, not realizing the danger that he's in yet, sees this woman and gets excited at all the things that he's going to do to her. It's only after the second protection is cast that he gets really angry and starts threatening her with some pretty gruesome things, like ripping off her limbs and forcing her to eat it, or breaking her fingers into tiny pieces then burning her face so that no one would recognize her. Though that was all in the Goblin language, so it was all just gibberish to her. It didn't really affect her mental state. After finally realizing that he was going to die unless he did something, the Goblin Lord puts on the facade of acting all innocent. In the manga, they show more than a few cases where this works, and the adventurers who think themselves strong would always turn their back on him and let him live, taking pity and forgiving him. Those that did all died painful deaths, something that the manga really wanted to hammer in. Of course, both Goblin Slayer and Priestess buy none of it and finish off the Lord. Now, as Priestess helps to carry Goblin Slayer back to the farm, she remembers the party members of her first adventure, the adventurers who were killed at the farm, the goblins who died alongside them, and even the Lord who just died in front of her eyes. It was from this that she became well aware of the weight of all the things that Goblin Slayer alone has had to deal with. Knowing this, she became happier with each step as she knew that she would be able to help carry at least a little bit of that weight with him. It's a realization that isn't explicitly stated in the anime or manga like it is in the light novel. It's more something that you have to assume she realizes as their relationship develops. Now, with the Goblin Lord defeated, it brings us to the rather wholesome ending, which honestly was a better ending than I could have ever expected for an anime like this. The adventurers were having a celebration, not only for their victory, but also to remember their fallen comrades. Goblin Slayer has a heartwarming conversation with Priestess, and everyone now acknowledges him as a fellow adventurer. This was consistent to the source material. The ending monologue, though, gave slightly different visuals with respect to what they were talking about. Rather than merely hinting at the gods being D&D players, they straight up showed the pieces, the players, the board, and even a little Goblin Slayer pawn piece. I figure if you're a D&D fan, then it's probably something that you're interested in seeing. Anyway, that's going to be it for the Goblin Slayer Cut Content series. With us getting deeper into the new season, I figure I can do either Shield Hero or Promised Neverland next. And don't worry, the Overlord videos are still coming, so just be patient. I just need to replace this series with something new, so feel free to let me know what you want in the comments below. Now, before I go, thanks again to Return of Warrior for sponsoring this video. You can use the link in the description to try out the free open beta today. Anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!